Hello, thank you. Yes, I'm Matt Deegan, the creative director of Folder Media. We operate some digital radio multiplexes across the country. We make content and services for broadcasters like the BBC, ITV and MTV, plus we run the national children's radio station Fun Kids. Now, the ASI got in touch when they saw a blog I'd written at mattdeegan.com about Radioplayer and some of their activities and suggested I get hold of somebody to talk to about it. And who better than the managing director of Radioplayer, Michael Hill. He was a BBC journalist. He had roles at 5 Live, then became its deputy controller, a brief sojourn at Channel 4 Radio, a return to the BBC, and then becoming the founder managing director at Radioplayer around 11 years ago. Hello, Mike.
Hi, thank you.
Really nice for you to be here. Thanks for saying yes. I mean, you've just sort of celebrated 10 years of Radioplayer as a product being out there. That must have been a point to really kind of look back and think about what you've done. I'm aware that some of our audience might not be aware of really what Radioplayer does. Some of it's in kind of in front of the radio, some of it's behind the scenes. Give us a little outline of what journey you've been on over the last 10 years.
Yeah, well, we always have to explain what Radioplayer is because we are unique. We're basically a radio platform that's 100% backed by the broadcasters. So we're not owned by faceless shareholders or investors or Americans, or we're just backed by the radio stations that you know and love from the UK, but also now increasingly from around the world. We're non-profit, 100% non-profit, so nobody's running off with any pounds stuffed up their jumper. The radio broadcasters invest in us for strategic reasons to get stuff done. Increasingly, the stuff that we're getting done is to do with keeping radio strong in cars, keeping radio strong in connected devices of all kinds, like smart speakers that are coming into our homes, wearables that are sitting on our wrists. 10 years ago, we were launched, as you rightly say. It was an idea from the BBC, working with the big commercial radio groups in the UK. But since then, we've expanded to have partnerships with 14 different countries, broadcasters in 14 different countries. And we're doing a lot more stuff than the things that we started.
So really at the beginning, and I remember sort of for Fun Kids, our children's radio station, it was about having a pop-up player for the desktop. Yep. And that just seems so quaint now, doesn't it? But that was, I remember that being incredibly important and lots of rows over what size it was and what it should include.
Yep.
I mean, what were some of those conversations actually sort of a warning of things to come?
Well, back then in 2010, when we were planning Radioplayer, online listening was only 2% of all radio listening. It was fluctuating around 2%. And so there was not much risk really to the BBC or the big commercial radio broadcasters to kind of putting themselves all into Radioplayer. At most, they would have affected 2% of their listening. And we had several studies done that showed that it was very likely that it would contribute to an uplift in that listening. So, there wasn't much risk to start with, but you're quite right. As soon as you put everyone's brands in a shared space, even something as simple as a slim pop-up player for a website, people really start to lean in and pay attention. How big is my logo versus someone else's? When I search for rock, what comes up first? I'm in York. What stations can I see? It becomes really, really important. Understandably so, because radio stations' brands are very, very important to them. And I guess that early experience really pointed out the value of metadata. Now, metadata is a really dull word, used mostly by engineers, but it means the information about the stuff that we consume. So the metadata that goes along with a movie on Netflix is the date it was filmed, the synopsis, the lead actors, even the subtitles would be classed as metadata. So everything that goes along with the content is metadata, information about the information. And in radio, it's similarly important, so that's obviously things like the station name, but also things like where can its stream be found and what geographical area does it represent? What would be its brand color if it wanted to set a color on a web page or on a mobile app. What's its Twitter handle? What's its Instagram address? And so increasingly that metadata is becoming really important. And back then it was really important. It dictated what stations you saw in York, or how big the logos were, or whether the stream could be found easily, and all those questions, those early questions that the broadcasters were asking. And today it's one of the absolute cornerstones of our offering to car companies, and I'll come on to that in a minute.
I mean, it's strange, isn't it? I mean, I remember right at the beginning and throughout the project, all this information existed, what you were playing on air, who the presenter was, all of those things, but it was in relatively disparate places.
Yeah.
And offering that up to someone who might want it for some reason was relatively difficult. Or you created something special for someone, or didn't bother because you couldn't really see the value in it.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the main outputs out of Radioplayer initially was that all the stations had basically sorted it all out and then got all their systems to send it
exactly
in the right way. And actually, once they send it to you, it's in a place that they might send it to someone else, or let you send it somewhere too. But unlocking that capability, I guess, for partners, obviously you needed it to display on a web page right at the beginning, but for how partners use that, that became a really essential part of your existence.
Yeah, it's one of the byproducts that we found, one of the happy accidents that's come about as a result of Radioplayer existing. In all the countries that we've launched Radioplayer in, that has happened, the thing that you just described. Everyone sorts out their streams, everyone sorts out their logos, everyone sorts out their now playing data. But the other thing that's happened is in some countries, they really weren't the broadcasters weren't round a table talking about anything particularly. We're quite good in the UK. We've often been round tables talking about marketing radio, or about measuring radio, or about dividing the spectrum, the broadcast spectrum for radio. But in some countries, none of that existed before they launched Radioplayer. And Radioplayer has given them an excuse to meet up every quarter and talk about not just Radioplayer, but radio, frankly. So yeah, it's had lots of interesting effects.
And that value of working together, probably in the modern world, that's kind of underestimated, isn't it? Because I think radio probably went from somewhere, like a lot of mainstream sort of existing legacy media, newspapers or telly, where you're kind of top of the tree and everyone has to work with you. You don't really have to work with them. In the digital world, that has shifted quite a lot, hasn't it? What shifted for radio? Who are the people that we have to deal with now?
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, I mentioned earlier that one of our top priorities is dealing with car companies. That's because that's the simple reason is that depending on where you are in the world, in-car listening may account for the majority of your listening hours. So it's absolutely critical to the future of radio. In the UK, it's about 25% of all listening hours. That's because pre-COVID, 1,000 years ago,
in the before times,
yes, we used to largely commute on public transport in the UK because we've got a very densely populated island. The roads get very jammed. We've got quite a good transport network, so lots of people used to commute on trains and buses, and not in their cars. But still, radio listening accounted for 25% of all listening. In Italy or the US, it's more than half of all radio listening because they do drive everywhere. And so the future of radio in cars is a really interesting example of why the radio sector needs to work together.
So historically, radio has been pretty good in cars. One of the early car, I think when I looked it up, I think one of the first in-car radios was some bright idea in the 30s or 40s. We've had the dominant space for quite a long time. People expect there to be radios in cars. Quite a lot of stations, relatively high quality, no subscription, free to air. It's not been a bad environment for the radio sector.
Correct, and we've seen off challenges like cassettes and CDs over the years, absolutely. And radio listening remains incredibly strong in cars, even with cassettes, CDs, and increasingly Bluetooth connections and other gizmos. There is, however, a massive change happening. It's happening incredibly slowly, but totally inexorably. And that's what happens in cars, right? think about the average car is driven for about 13 or 14 years before it's scrapped. So, at one end of the pipe, you're injecting several million cars a year onto the road. They then dominate the habits of those drivers for 13 years until at the other end of the pipe, they're put on the scrap heap. So there's an incredible inertia built in, but there's an inevitability to that input happening. Now, more than that, it takes 4 or 5 years for a car to be designed by a car company before it even thinks about hitting the showrooms, right? So if you add that together, you've got the 13 years on the road, you've got 4 or 5 years before that in the planning. Talking about the best part of 20 years, where a car's design is going to have a measurable impact on the habits of the drivers, including their radio listening. So if we don't engage with car companies right now, in 10 or 15 years, we could be screwed. And the reason why we could be screwed is the cars that we are seeing coming through at the start of that pipe, the ones that are going onto the road now to drive their 13 years, are all internet connected. They all, or most of them, have a big touchscreen in front of them. And increasingly, they've got things like Spotify, music services, Apple Music, streaming services, even video coming through for self-driving cars. So much more connectivity, many more entertainment options, some of them often baked into the dashboard. And we believe this is going to be a much bigger threat to radio than cassettes or CDs were.
Because isn't there something like SIM cards are mandated in new cars anyway for safety?
Yeah.
And I think often, like whatever car you're in, you sort of assume that's the features everyone's got, don't you? And then you sort of forget that actually it's 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, and you're not really sure what's coming off the production line right now. What is coming off the production line right now for radios?
Yeah, so you're quite right. Every car for the last 2 years or so in the EU has had to have a SIM card in it for connectivity. Now that is mostly for safety reasons, so that, believe it or not, if the vehicle crashes, it can dial the emergency services itself. But increasingly, the car companies are choosing to use that embedded SIM that they have had to put in anyway for data. Either getting the customer to pay for that data or paying for it themselves in the high-end cars. And with data comes connectivity and entertainment. So the cars that are coming off the production lines right now are likely to have much bigger screens, screens probably the average kind of medium-sized tablet or iPad kind of screen, fairly high resolution ones as well, so they look quite good. Voice control, obviously touch control as well on the screen. And a lot of those entertainment services, like music streaming that I mentioned earlier, are likely to be baked in from the start. So when you first turn on your car, you're likely to see a menu of entertainment options, where before you may have only seen the radio.
And what do the car manufacturers want to be on that screen? Because obviously that's the radio sector is competing with some other people, question mark who they are. What do the car manufacturers want to give people in the dashboard?
That's an interesting question. We talk to a lot of car manufacturers, and at the moment the industry is in a great deal of churn, not just because of COVID, but because of electrification. So the oncoming need to change cars over to electric power to combat the climate emergency is causing them to rethink all their systems. So they're not just bolting batteries and an electric motor into the old cars that they used to build. They're looking at the whole holistic car from the ground up. So you've got electrification, you've got connectivity, and you've got COVID. And those three things have combined to form a perfect storm. And the car companies are shrinking down because they've lost a lot of their revenue. They didn't sell many cars last year. They're shrinking down their teams, and they're repurposing them as well. So, for example, they're laying off most of the people who used to do the R&D for diesel and petrol engines, because they know that those diesel and petrol engines are as evolved as they're ever going to be. They can rinse another 2 or 3 models out of the power units that they've got by just optimizing them a bit. And they will not do the R&D in any new petrol or diesel engines now for the foreseeable future, well, forever probably. So they've sacked all them. All the petrol and diesel guys have gone. And what they're doing in the dashboard space is there's an interesting battle between the kind of old guys who knew how to make radios work with aerials on the roof and DAB or FM tuners, and all the hardware side of things, and the bright young 20-somethings who are basically app developers coming in and treating the car as a tablet. And the problem is that those bright young 20-somethings probably don't listen to much of the radio themselves. So in some cases, we've found that they're treating radio as an afterthought. They've really done a brilliant Spotify integration. They've done a fantastic sat-nav integration. You can dial your mum on video calls while you're doing 80 on the M1. But when you say, well, how can I listen to Capital or Fun Kids? They go, oh shit, we forgot the radio. Damn. I know, we'll pull some crappy app together at the last minute and stuff it in, and that'll be good enough, won't it? Because it's just radio. Nobody listens to that anymore, do they? Well, yes, actually, 90% of the UK listens to the radio every week. And it's still, even in cars that are equipped with all the latest technology, it remains by far the biggest entertainment medium, the most used entertainment medium.
And Radioplayer did research with listeners about how they used cars and dashboards and the radio as well. Yeah. What did that show?
So that was a few years ago now. It was called Great Cars Need Great Radios, and it showed that it was a big study, 1,000 people across UK, France, and Germany, which is statistically significant enough to be able to extrapolate decent figures. One of the headlines was that 82% of us would never dream of owning a car without a radio. Now we're going to actually, interestingly, we're going to redo that study or something like it to see whether that number's gone up or down. But I was looking this morning at a study from the US, Caravan USA it's called, and they've interviewed 1,000 adults as well. And 91% of them said it was important to have a radio in the dashboard. So and post-COVID, that's become even more important apparently, with lots of people listening to news and speech content to stay up to speed with what's happening. So I think that when we redo that study, we'll find that radio is just as important as a content medium as it ever has been to drivers.
I mean, this is where it's interesting for Radioplayer, isn't it? Because you doing that sort of research on behalf of lots of countries gives an answer to, what are there, probably like 10 major car companies now that probably are 90% of cars. I guess they've got one point of contact now for what is radio.
Yeah, if you think about the car industry, and not many people do actually. I mean, we just get into them and switch on and drive, don't we? But it's a $3 trillion a year sector. Their revenue, their turnover, $3 trillion a year. They employ over 8 million people directly in making cars, and the average car's got 30,000 parts. So it's and all those parts are made by someone different. So Toyota don't make the 30,000 parts that go into a Toyota. They're what we call in the industry, we call them an OEM, an original equipment manufacturer. But then they have tier 1 suppliers, tier 2 suppliers, tier 3 suppliers, really complicated working relationships with all these different companies around the world who are making, the brake pad linings or the bulbs for the headlights, or the radios and the screens and the tuners and the aerials, or the apps indeed for the touchscreens. So yes, it's an incredibly complicated sector, and there's not many options for the radio industry. We could either say, oh, screw it, no one from radio is going to talk to the car company. It's too complicated. Let's just leave it up to the car companies and see what happens. Well, to be honest, that hasn't ended very well. We are seeing those pretty crappy radio interfaces coming through, in some cases with the wrong station logos being shown, and jargon coming through on the screen with strange acronyms, and not very user-friendly interfaces, very old-fashioned interfaces as well. So radio tuning dials, even though you're in an app space with a digital touchscreen. Radio buried 3 menus down. So I think it's not cool for us to just leave it up to the car companies. Someone from radio needs to interact with the car companies at some level. So I guess the other option is that every radio station in the world could try to talk to every car company in the world. Don't think that's going to happen, because radio is a pretty slim sector as a whole, and mostly in a radio station you're thinking about who's presenting breakfast tomorrow, not whether I've got a 3 p.m. call with the CEO of Ford. So I don't think that's going to happen. I guess the other option would be to leave it to a third party. And that's where it becomes really interesting. Could we trust Google to build radios for us? Could we trust Apple? Could we trust one of the big commercial radio aggregators that exist? I'm not sure whether we should do that, if I'm honest. Do they have our best interests at heart, is the first question I would ask. And the answer is, well, no, they're actually really answerable to their shareholders and their investors. They want to make money. And that's not always the same as making great radio experiences and protecting radio's brands.
Obviously, Radioplayer as a co-op and owned by the radio companies in the different countries. Obviously, the argument would be that you're in a good place to do that and have the interests of your shareholders, which is the radio sector, in mind. You did some work recently with VW Group to try and help them do the radio that you/the sector wants. How did that go?
Yeah, I mean, that's VW Group are the biggest car company in the world, so good to start with them. In 2017, we signed an agreement with them to send them a feed of metadata. I use the M word again. It's that dull information, but crucial information about all the radio stations, where their logos are, where their streams are, what's playing right now. And that was to enable them to enhance their hybrid radio. So a hybrid radio is a multi-platform radio that can get DAB, digital radio, FM and streaming all in one lovely interface and show the station logos and show what's playing right now. So we helped them with that feed in 2017. That was a landmark agreement that we signed with them. And last year, they were so pleased with what we were doing with them that they re-signed that agreement and they extended it to include discussions about the interface. That means that we're on an almost weekly basis having calls with VW engineers to talk about how radios are going to look in the future in VW cars. And the VW Group is not just VWs. It's Skodas, it's Porsches, it's lots of different brands all under the VW umbrella, Audis as well. And to the VW partnership agreement, we added a few weeks ago actually an agreement with BMW. And that now takes us up to, we've now got, with those two agreements, we're talking to car companies which represent about 1/3 of all sales in Europe. So Radioplayer's now talking directly to car companies representing 33% of all those new cars going onto the pipeline that we talked about earlier, which means we've got a real chance of affecting how the radios look and behave in those cars.
And what's the output of that? So if all goes to plan, in 3 years when the next lot of cars roll out with your thoughts in, your technology in, what does that mean for consumers?
Well, hopefully it means brilliant radio experiences that are full of the official radio metadata that's being sent from broadcasters. So when you're listening to Fun Kids, the right logo is being displayed on the screen, and it's a beautiful high resolution logo that's doing your brand justice. It's great streams coming from broadcasters as well, so that if the radio needs to fall back to streaming, if it hasn't got a strong DAB or an FM signal and it falls back to an internet stream, that's a really, really high quality stream coming directly from the broadcaster with no extra advertising being layered on top by one of these commercial aggregator platforms that I talked about earlier. That's really important to the radio sector, that the right content flows through to that important endpoint. It's a simple interface on the screen that doesn't distract the driver by being too complicated, but still has sophistication. So podcasts arriving on the screen from each broadcaster, now playing information arriving on the screen from each broadcaster, so that when you compare a brilliant music streaming service like Spotify next to a brilliant radio experience like we're building with VW and BMW, you can see there's parity. It looks modern. It looks app-like. It responds to your voice controls correctly. It plays the right station that you've asked for. Now, these things sound pretty basic, but actually they can be quite broken in some of the cars of today.
And also to work across 30, 40, 50,000 radio stations as well.
Exactly. It's really challenging. And also, as we expand around the world and broadcasters choose our model for their region, we're having to deal with lots of different languages too. So that gives us, for something like voice recognition, that gives us an even bigger challenge. So we've had to come up with the right metadata, there's the M word again, for expressing phonetic synonyms. So in other words, spelling station names phonetically so that Alexa and Google Home and Siri and all the other voice platforms in the world can understand how that radio station should be recognized by the system and how that radio station's name should be pronounced by the system in all the different languages in which we work. It's quite a big task.
And all of this really is about kind of keeping the medium competitive, isn't it? Because it's again, legacy issues. If you don't change or stay up to date with what other people are doing, they'll jump in. And I'm very aware that Spotify is sort of testing something they call the Spotify thing, which is sort of like a Bluetooth adapter, which allows you to kind of pin Spotify to your car. So everyone else does want a bit of this space, don't they?
Yeah, they do. Everyone is trying to appropriate the word radio, including Spotify. So the R word is incredibly important and powerful. And everyone is trying to appropriate the center of the dashboard, which has always been the place for radio. So yes, there are tanks revving up and trying to park on our lawn. And we're not going to take it, easily. We're not going to roll over and let it happen, which is why we're working very closely with all these car companies to get brilliant radio experiences baked into the center of the dashboard for decades to come. The Spotify car thing is an interesting device because in many ways it's just a kind of wrapper. It doesn't have it doesn't have a SIM card of its own, so it's got no data connectivity at all. It's basically piggybacking on your phone. So, the question has to be, why wouldn't the user just use a mobile phone holder and continue to use the excellent Spotify app experience to control their Spotify? Why would you add, especially if you had to pay for it, why would you add another piece of plastic, another screen to your clamped onto your air vent in your car, if it's really not giving you anything beyond a window into your phone? Because that's all it's giving you. I think it's a bit of a marketing puff. It's Spotify trying things out, which is fine, by the way. We've done the same thing. I'm not sure it's going to take off, if I'm honest.
Because that thing is, it just shows that demand for that space we hop into to drive to work or drive to school or whatever. Is a powerful environment that people spend time in.
Oh yeah. And these multi-billion-dollar tech firms and entertainment firms are investing heavily in trying to appropriate part of that environment. Absolutely.
That's great, Michael Hill. Thank you very much.
Thank you.